Maintenance workers, anxious mothers, urban explorers. These are just a few of the folks who have gone into subways and subway tunnels, only to encounter the unexplained and downright disturbing. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. Prepare yourself for today's episode, where we go underground for some allegedly true and scary subway stories. Real quick, if you're on YouTube, you should like this video and subscribe for more terrifying stories. If you're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or another podcast platform, follow Unexplained Encounters and leave us a rating or review to help us scare more people. And you can send us your scary stories of the unknown at darkstories.org. Now, let's begin. I'll never go back in the subway again. From Fibbian. It was very close to midnight, but I couldn't be certain at the time. My sense of time was muddled by stress and exhaustion that night. I had worked an extra hour at the diner, then stopped by the 24-hour grocery mart for diapers, baby formula, and a few items for breakfast. My daughter, who was then only 6 months old, was dozing in the sling across my chest. It was late, later than I promised the new babysitter, who had agreed to watch my toddler son for me at home. The babysitter was a nice college girl, and she was expecting me by 11:15 at the latest, but at my best guess, it would have been around 11:30, maybe even a quarter to midnight. My husband wouldn't be home till dawn either. He worked a third-shift job at a packaging plant, and I didn't want to leave the babysitter alone with the toddler any longer than necessary. She was new to the neighborhood, not entirely comfortable with kids yet, I could tell. So there I was, a mother all alone with a baby in a sling, sitting in a near-empty subway car heading back home. The overhead lights buzzed on occasion. My paper grocery bag, full but carefully balanced, rested on the seat next to me. There were only a few other passengers in the car. A man flipping through a magazine, a woman in a hooded sweatshirt, and other than that, I can't recall. But I do remember all of us looking quite tired. As we rattled through the tunnels, I counted the minutes. 2 more stops. If we stayed on schedule, I'd be home in about 15 minutes. I tried to calm myself by adjusting my daughter's sling, feeling the soft warmth of her tiny body. She stirred a little but stayed mostly asleep. The train lurched around a bend, and I found myself thinking about the babysitter again. What if my toddler gave her heck? What if he decided to be a little demon tonight? All the worst images appeared in my head at once. She was probably checking the clock repeatedly, wondering what the heck I was even doing. That was when it happened. The lights in the subway car flickered once, twice, and then they plunged the car into total darkness. The subway often had momentary glitches in the lighting. Old wiring, I guessed, but this blackout lasted a few seconds longer than usual. In that sudden darkness, every sense sharpened. I heard my baby's soft rhythmic breathing, the distant hum of wheels on rails, and what I thought was the faint scrape of something near the back of the car. A strange panic flared in my gut. I turned my head instinctively, squinting into the dark, and that's when I saw it, or thought I saw it. There was a figure in the far corner, impossibly tall and thin, almost as if its body had been stretched. It had a smooth, featureless face. At least, I saw no eyes and no nose, and its head was bent sharply forward, as if the ceiling were far too low for it to stand upright. Its shoulders were narrow, arms way too long, ending somewhere near the knees. I could feel its stare. It was a sickening sensation, like icy fingers trailing down my spine. I gasped, jumped back, and that's when the lights blinked back on. The subway car looked exactly as before. The other passengers were there, none seeming alarmed. The corner where I'd seen the figure now revealed only a metal pole and empty seats. there was no one there. When I eventually looked around, the other folks were looking at me, curiously or confused. My sharp intake of breath must have been pretty loud. A bit embarrassed and also rattled, I forced a weak smile and settled back into my seat. Stress and fatigue, I told myself. That's all it was. A trick of the shadows. The lights went out, my mind played a prank. That's all it was. But I couldn't shake this weird feeling. My skin prickled when I visualized it again. I tried to think on something else. The grocery bag, the baby's gentle weight, the passing stations. Soon I would be home. Soon I would see my son and have my daughter back at home, and I could send the babysitter home with a tip, apologizing for my lateness. But then, the lights went off again, this time without warning. Instantly, that feeling of suffocating dread returned. The car rattled, and in that void of blackness, I felt my pulse spike. I could see nothing, not even my hands, but I sensed movement. A presence, slow yet forceful, its footsteps crossing the aisle. Something was coming towards me, and I had a very bad feeling I knew what it was. My baby whimpered, as if stirred by its presence too. I put a hand over her back and held her close. There was a flicker, light struggling to return to the car, but all it did was reveal what was coming towards me. It was that tall silhouette again, much, much closer than before. It stood right in front of me now, towering over my seat. In that half-second glimpse, I saw that featureless, elongated face inches from my own. I heard a faint rustle, like dry paper, and smelled something stale and cold. The lights snuffed out completely once more, and I screamed, without meaning to, an instinctive, terrified cry. Then, as if my scream had broken the spell, the lights snapped back on with a steady hum. The figure was gone, not even a shadow. The other passengers had now bolted upright and were startled by my outburst. After a brief pause of them staring at me, I heard someone murmur, "This lady's losing it." And then, without saying anything else, they retreated to a different car. At that moment, I was alone except for my baby. The door hissed shut as the others left. I could see through the small window that the others had moved and sat down already in a different car. They would no longer be bothered with me anymore. I swallowed hard. The car was silent except for the squeal of metal wheels. I tried to convince myself again that it was a hallucination, that I've been awake too long and I've been too stressed the entire time. Twice now I'd seen something that vanished as soon as the light turned back on, but that defied every law of physics known to man, so it couldn't be real. I held my daughter tighter anyway, murmuring gently to keep myself calm as much as her. I dared not look down the aisle. The train would be at my stop in only a few moments. I just had to endure the ride. I counted my breaths, watching the flickering neon ads that zipped by outside the window. Anything to ground myself in reality. So far, so good, too. No more flickering lights, no more apparitions. I was beginning to think maybe I'd scared myself silly over nothing. Just as we were preparing to slow into my station, a matter of another minute or so at most, I felt it. A pressure on my left shoulder. Not a violent grab, but a gentle, steady weight, as if someone tall were leaning down and lightly draping an arm around me. The skin on my neck crawled. My baby stirred awake and began to fuss. I froze, too scared to move. The arm felt cold and smooth. It didn't feel like normal human flesh. It reminded me of polished plastic, but it was heavy enough that I could clearly feel it compressing my jacket. I stared straight ahead, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, heart pounding so loud I was certain someone else would be able to hear it if I wasn't alone. I must have sat like that for 30 seconds, maybe less, but honest to God, it felt like hours. In my peripheral vision, I saw nothing. The reflection in the window across from me showed only me and empty seats. Yet the weight on my shoulder was very real and persisted. Finally, I felt the train slow down. The wheels screeched against the track, and the familiar pre-recorded voice announced my stop. The doors slid open with their usual hiss. In that instant, the pressure vanished, as though the thing had pulled away and was disappointed. My baby let out a soft wail, sensing my distress. Without daring to look around, I stood up, clutching the groceries in one hand and pressing my daughter against my chest with the other. I stepped onto the platform and nearly stumbled, my legs all shaky. The doors closed behind me and the train sped off into the darkness, hopefully taking whatever it was with it. Once outside the station, under the reassuring glow of streetlights, I breathed deeply. I was shaking all over. The world felt very quiet at that moment. I could hear my daughter sniffling. Then she settled down, and I hurried home as fast as I could. When I reached the apartment, the babysitter was in the living room looking relieved. My toddler was asleep in bed. I paid her, tipped her of course, thanked her and apologized for being late. After she left, I locked every door and every window, then sat in my kitchen for half an hour, trembling, my head in my hands. The next morning, when my husband got home from his shift, I told him we had to have a car. Any car. Something cheap, something that worked, something that would let me avoid that subway for the rest of my life. I didn't go into much more detail than that. He must have seen the fear in my eyes because he didn't question it. We agreed to start saving immediately. And, lucky me, I never had to take the subway again. I can't explain what I experienced. Maybe it was nerves and exhaustion. Maybe a trick of faulty lights and a feverish mind. But I know what I felt, and I know what I saw. And I know I never want to see it again. The Living Graffiti. From Pre-ordaved. Back in the early 90s, I landed a maintenance gig in an aging subway system beneath a large city. I won't specify exactly where, just in case, but I'll say somewhere on the East Coast. I was young then, taking what jobs I could find, and working underground paid better than I expected. The hours were rough and hard to get used to, and the tunnels smelled like damp concrete and stale air. But you learned to get used to it. The system had been built decades earlier, with extensions and renovations layered over time. That left behind a maze of side passages, old spurs, sealed-off service corridors. My team's job was to check structural integrity, patch leaks, and occasionally remove graffiti. And graffiti was everywhere down there. Some fresh and bold, others faded into barely readable scrawls. We mostly ignored it unless the supervisors insisted on repainting certain sections. I first heard the strange rumors after my second week. Two coworkers, I'll refer to them as Larry and Starla, mentioned shifting tags on a line near a closed platform. They joked about it half-heartedly, as if uncertain how seriously to take it themselves. You cover up a piece one night and next time you're there it's rearranged, Larry said. Starla shrugged as if to say it sounded ridiculous. I assumed it was pranks by bored teenagers finding secret ways in. The city wasn't short on people willing to sneak underground for different thrills. But as time went on, I heard more weird accounts. A younger worker said he'd once lost a small tool pouch near a suspicious patch of paint and found it the next shift, shredded, as if bitten through by something with no real teeth marks, just ragged tears and a wet residue he couldn't identify. He didn't report it though. Didn't really sound believable. I kept the stories though at the back of my mind. I was skeptical. The tunnels had rats, stray cats, maybe even a lost dog on occasion. Those could explain torn items. Still, the details nagged at me, especially when I started to notice spots of graffiti that seemed different. Occasionally, I'd come across a large mural or a cluster of tags in an odd nook. The paint would look fresh one night, then strangely faded or repatterned the next, and that's without any new paint odor or drips that you would expect from human taggers. My first personal brush with it happened in a side passage near a disused maintenance hatch. I'd gone down to check a persistent water seep. The corridor was dim, lit only by my flashlight. The walls were layered with old paint. Some of the tags there were decades old and flaking off, but others did look more recent. Those had sharp lines and peculiar designs, almost organic. As I passed my light over one such patch, I thought I saw something move. Just a slight ripple, like paint swelling outward and then settling flat. I leaned in thinking maybe it was moisture under a loose paint layer. But when I tapped lightly with my flashlight's handle, it just felt like solid concrete. I shook my head, blaming fatigue, and moved on, but my spine tingled for hours after. I decided to ask a veteran worker about it, someone who had been around longer. That's how I ended up talking to Carl. Carl had worked down there since the late 70s and had seen his fair share of oddities. He looked at me hard when I mentioned the shifting paint rumor. After a moment, he sighed and said that I should talk to Miller instead. Miller, he said, had a story and a scar to match. That sounded dramatic, but I tracked Miller down during a coffee break in the underground break room. Miller was older, graying at the temples with a quiet demeanor. He listened to my questions, even though I was a bit hesitant, then rolled up his sleeve. On his inner wrist was a scar, thin and pale, shaped not like any bite mark I'd seen, but more like a burn in a strange pattern, long and sinuous, almost like a leech had gotten him. He tapped it with a fingertip. "Got this about a decade ago," he said quietly, "back when I tried to see what was behind a suspicious patch of paint." He then said he called them scrawl leeches. Said he got too close once, cornered a section of wall that looked like graffiti but bulged slightly in the center. He thought it was a hollow spot, or a prank. When he touched it, part of the paint layer peeled back like a wet curtain, and something beneath lashed out, some membrane or tendril that burned his skin before he could yank his arm away. He never got a good look at the entire thing, just that it retreated into a crack as soon as he shouted and turned his flashlight fully on it. I stared at the scar, trying not to appear too rattled. Miller shrugged grimly. "These things, they mimic paint. They blend in with all that layering. From what I've gathered, they move quietly at night, shifting patterns to lure small animals close. Cats or rats or even small dogs that wander on in. They're little predators, hidden in plain sight." I wanted to say that sounded absolutely insane, but I remembered my own unsettling glimpse, that shredded tool pouch story too, along with the other rumors. The subway's older sections were rarely visited. Perhaps if strange creatures evolved or had migrated down there, who would know? Another worker, Justine, joined the conversation. She swore she found weird smears on the floor once, tracks of oily color leading to nowhere. She thought it was spilled paint until she found a half-chewed rat carcass nearby. The carcass looked as if something had pressed it against the wall until fluids drained. Justine said she never walked alone again if she could help it. Over the next few weeks, I grew more cautious. Our supervisors never acknowledged the creatures. They preferred to dismiss odd findings as just animals or vandalism. But the workers whispered amongst themselves. Miller was of the belief that if you ventured into the deepest closed-off areas, the oldest tunnels slated for no future use, you would find entire colonies of these scrawl leeches, clinging to the walls like living murals, waiting silently. He had personally never went that far himself, but claimed someone he trusted encountered multiple at once and fled before he was noticed. My second direct encounter occurred after I dropped my flashlight's spare battery pack near a suspiciously colorful section of wall. It was late in the shift, and I was alone in a dead-end passage, checking on a reported seepage. I bent down to retrieve the battery and glanced up to see the paint patterns above me beginning to glisten. That's the best word I can find. Glisten, like it was wet. I froze, watching as what I thought were stylized letters shimmered, then twitched slightly. I caught a glimpse of something like a segmented limb pulling back into the paint layer. There was a soft, wet crackling sound, almost too faint to register. I didn't stay to investigate. I backed away slowly, never turning my back, until I reached a better-lit junction. Only then did I run, suddenly very creeped out about my work environment. In the following days, I spoke to a few more coworkers. One swore he saw something drip from a painted eye, a bead of liquid that hit the ground and vanished. Another claimed that the patterns of the things changed shape, not randomly but strategically, creating hiding spots or camouflage to ambush prey. None of us had hard proof, though. We never took photos or samples, partly out of fear. What if the flash of a camera startled these things? What if reaching too close would earn us a scar like Miller's, or worse? Admitting these creatures existed would also mean facing something we couldn't easily explain to bosses or police or anyone else. I tried to carry a heavier flashlight and a small pry bar for a while. The idea being that if something did lash out, at least I had something to defend myself with. But the more I thought about it, the more futile it seemed. These creatures had the home advantage. They blended in perfectly with the decades of paint. They chose quiet corners and infrequent paths. We were in their territory, not the other way around. One evening near the end of my time working there, I turned a corner and found evidence of a recent kill. A quick warning to those who are squeamish when it comes to violence against pets and animals. Alright then. It was a part of a cat's remains pressed against a painted motif that looked suspiciously like a distorted face. The flesh had puncture marks, but not like teeth. More like pressure points where paint had solidified into something sharp. It was horrific. I backed away, feeling a bit nauseous. The beam of my flashlight caught a bit of movement in the corner of my eye. Just enough to confirm one of the shapes shifting back into a flat pattern when illuminated. That sealed it for me. Though I was sure these things would never kill me, it was still something I didn't want to stay for. Sure, I was unsettled, creeped out, but the fact that the company wouldn't officially address it really weighed on me. The unwritten rules of the place were quite clear. Keep quiet, do your job, and go home. The old tunnels belonged to the leeches now, and we had no plan to eradicate them. Why risk my life, or at least risk a scar or two, in a place that harbored hidden predators that no one wanted to admit were real? Within a month, I put in a request for a transfer, citing personal reasons. Eventually, I found railway work several states away above ground. It paid less, but the fresh air and open spaces suited me just fine. Plus, there was no cryptid or supernatural nonsense to worry about. I never did tell my new coworkers about these scrawl leeches. Who would believe it anyway? The early 90s was a different time. Documentation wasn't as easy. Even if I had snapped a picture, what then? People would think I faked it or misread stains. It wasn't really the type of creature that even looked suspicious if caught on photo. It would just look like paint or graffiti. Believe the story, or don't. It's not the scariest, but it is strange. All in all, I hope you enjoyed it as a creepy or unsettling story. Have you heard of the Chisel Man? From Graded Dead 3. I remember when I first started taking those late-night trains on that old subway line. It was early 1993, around spring. The MTA had mostly phased it out by then, leaving just a few midnight runs for odd commuters like me. I was working 2 part-time jobs and going to night classes, so the late hours were my only option. Those trains were pretty quiet and half-lit, rattling through tunnels that seemed older and more fragile each time I rode. The schedules were erratic and the stops were often deserted. I rarely saw more than a handful of other passengers, and sometimes none at all. Now, the pay at my jobs was minimal, but I couldn't afford a car at the time. So this was my life, a ghost ride through the city's underbelly, accompanied by a metal serpent running on old steel bones. There was always a creepiness about the after-hours subway, though. Maybe everyone feels like this, but maybe it was just me, being underground so late, with very few people. The place just seemed creepier than the daytime. It didn't help that the fluorescent lights sometimes flickered, and the trains would shudder in their tracks. The conductors weren't very talkative either. The few transit workers I glimpsed behind grimy windows always looked so tired. Most nights, there were more maintenance crews than passengers. That's how I first heard about the Chisel Man. It was late night. I was riding on one of the trains. Most of the cars were empty as usual. The folks that were around were half asleep or lost in their own world. I spotted this crumpled pamphlet left on a seat. An old guide to track closures, faded text warning of unforeseen conditions in older tunnels. I turned it over, just bored really. Someone had scribbled in pen, "Chisel Man, still down here?" There was no telling what that meant, so I put it back where I found it and tried not to fall asleep. A few weeks passed by, and I swear I kept running into that name. I saw it on a yellowed newspaper clipping left behind on a bench, even once written in graffiti on a station column, visible only when the train was slowing. It was always vague, never a direct warning but more like a whispered rumor. I was starting to think it was some sort of inner-city inside joke that I just wasn't in on, kind of like that old Kilroy drawing from World War II. If you haven't heard about it, it's this little dude peering over a wall that was easy to draw, and during World War II, people often found it graffitied in places, kind of like one of the first memes. So I didn't put much stock into this Chisel Man thing. I finally got a lore dump one night. I was waiting for my train, which was apparently a bit late, when I noticed someone else waiting. A man about my age with a heavy coat and a worn leather satchel. He was eyeing the platform, about as tired and annoyed as I was. When my train finally pulled up, the man got up too. We seemed to be the only 2 passengers. We sat in the same car. I recalled seeing him once or twice before, and I decided to lean forward to strike up a conversation. It was the usual stuff. How he was doing tonight, what we do for a living, and how work has been. Then, during the first awkward pause in conversation, I brought up the strange Chisel Man things I've been seeing. I could tell by his reaction he was familiar with it. Here's what he told me, the best I can remember it now. Back in the 50s, there was a serial killer. A nasty one. I mean, if half the old news is true. They said he used a chisel, of all things. Stalked people at night, left no clear pattern, besides the way he killed. He vanished after a chase through the streets one summer night. The cops thought he might have gone underground, literally. Some claim they searched these tunnels for weeks and found nothing. Officially, he got away clean, or maybe he died down here. But unofficially, word is he never left these tunnels. I asked in all curiosity and seriousness if he was saying the killer's ghost was believed to be down here. He folded his arms and shook his head yes. He believed it was a legend that grew too big, or that at the very least it was a copycat who was just messing around, trying to get attention for himself. Over the next several days, I kept looking for more evidence. I had turned this urban legend of the Chisel Man into my pastime whenever I was bored down here waiting on or in the trains. One night, my awkward self was quietly trying to build up confidence to approach a station attendant, one of the older-looking ones, to see if he knew something. I walked up to one, a guy whose name tag said Mally, and asked him vaguely if there were any old urban legends about killers in the subway. He looked at me and said, "What are you asking about that for? Don't be coming down here to spread more stories." He then walked away, seemingly irritated. But that was enough to tell me that he had heard something, just didn't want to talk about it. But then I heard something that made it more real. A couple of college kids one day, waiting on their scheduled ride. They were talking about one of their friends who had seen a creepy guy holding something metal near an abandoned platform. They didn't say Chisel Man, but it made me think of the story. Months went by, and eventually I lost interest in the story and quit thinking and asking about it altogether. One night, the train I was on slowed near the old City Hall extension. The area we were passing by was long closed off to the public. The lights were dimmer there, workers probably not bothering to replace them as often as they should. I remember peering through the window more closely, not because of any stories about the Chisel Man. Again, I'd stopped thinking about that for a while now, but more curious as to this abandoned area. Wanted to see what it looked like. And that's when I caught a glimpse of movement. A face ducking behind a support beam. Pale, hollowed-eyed, gone in a flash. Better yet, I swear I saw something in his hand. Something metal that he had been scraping along the floor, where there was very clearly now scratch spots, like a tool dragged along concrete. Immediately I thought, Chisel Man. That creeped me out for the next week, and it also brings me to the end of this story. No direct encounters, not extremely scary really, just the idea that a serial killer who was never caught might still be down there, and I might have seen him. Or it was probably just some homeless man passing the time like I was. In his own way, of course. Who knows? Demon or Deranged Pit Bull. From 34th Emerald. I never should have been on that train so late at night. But after moving back in with my parents, I no longer had the luxury of a short commute. Before the recent breakup with my boyfriend at the time, I could walk home in 20 minutes. Now I lived across the city, back in my old bedroom with faded posters on the walls. My parents were kind folks, but hovering, and this long subway ride was my new normal. That evening, I'd stayed late at the office trying to impress my boss, and ended up on the last train heading out of Manhattan to the quiet residential district where my parents lived. By the time I stepped onto the nearly empty subway car, it was close to midnight. The train rattled along, lights flickering occasionally. Only a few other passengers shared the space with me. Some young guy dozing off with headphones, a couple whispering quietly. I think they may have been fighting, so it was relatable. And an old man humming tunelessly near the far door. I tried not to people watch too much. I was just staring at my reflection in the window instead. I remember thinking, God, I looked tired. But it was the kind of tired that sleep didn't fix. My ex and I had been together for 3 years after all. It was all gone now, and there I was riding late trains like some displaced traveler in a different city, despite this city being my home. The station where I had to transfer was one of those older ones deep underground, with tiled walls that hadn't been scrubbed in decades. When I stepped off, I thought I was going to be on a quiet and empty platform. But right away, as the train began to leave behind me, leaving me alone, I began to hear a strange scuffling noise echoing down the corridor. It was a strange sound to hear in the subway, so it made me freeze for a second. As it left, the train's lights reflected on the damp floor. I could smell disinfectant and old grease. When the train was completely gone, I tried to ignore the ongoing scuffling noise. I assumed it was some machinery hidden behind the wall, maybe some workers who worked down here, going about their business behind closed doors. I gripped my purse a bit tighter and started toward the stairs that would lead me up to the surface. After a dozen steps, I noticed a shape near the far end of the platform. I was a bit unsettled then. There was something large over there, low to the ground. It looked like a big dog. Street dogs do sometimes wander down here, right? But what for? As I edged closer, my curiosity turned to horror. Under a couple of flickering fluorescent lights, I made out the form of a large pit bull-looking dog. It had dark, dirty fur, and it was hunched over something, chewing at it, tearing into it. And then I covered my mouth trying not to scream, or maybe throw up, because what it was tearing at was a person, a human body. To this day, I swear that's what I saw. A person, lifeless, being eaten alive by what appeared to be a pit bull, but quite a bit bigger than the biggest pit bull I've ever seen. I saw a limp arm, a shoe. I saw the dog tearing into flesh with wet, ripping sounds. Though I covered my mouth not to scream, I did release a quiet gasp in the moment, and I wanted to faint when I saw that dog's head snap up, ears pricked, eyes looking at me. I felt paralyzed in that split second. Neither me nor the dog moved. After a few seconds, I heard a low growl, and it let whatever part was in its mouth drop to the ground with a plop. The thing's body language changed as its muscles tensed and legs stood from its position. It started to move towards me. Fear surged through me, and like a prey animal, I spun around and ran for my life, ignoring the stitch in my side and my pounding chest. I could hear its paw steps echoing in the empty corridor as I fled down a side passage deeper into the station's halls. I didn't even think to scream. I didn't even know where I was going. I just remembered panting like a mad dog myself and the clicking of claws behind me that gave me goosebumps. And then a thought popped into my head. If I didn't know where I was going, being chased by something probably faster than me, I had to find a place to hide. Around a corner, I thankfully spotted a restroom sign. I darted inside. It was a one-person bathroom with a heavy door and a lock. I slammed it shut and locked it, then curled up in the floor, shaking all over. In just a second, showing me just how close it had been, I heard scratching and clawing at the door, sniffing too. That's when I began to really scream. I let it all out, all my fear and terror. Soon, the clawing and scratching noises stopped, and I heard clacking claws fading away. It was gone. I crawled silently across the disgusting bathroom floor and put my ear against the door. I didn't hear anything. Unlike a random horror movie, I didn't leave at the first sign of silence. I instead stayed in that locked, safe, and gross bathroom for about 4 or 5 more minutes. After that, it wasn't even my idea to leave. Instead, a janitor opened up the door, using a key or something to unlock the lock. Didn't know they could do that, but I guess it makes sense. I was found on the floor huddled, with tears in my eyes. He asked if I was all right and said that he had heard screaming. I ran towards him, looked past him through the corridor, to see that there was nothing out there. It was just us. "There was a dog. It chased me. It ate someone." I must have sounded crazy as I tried to explain it. The janitor looked confused and scared. I grabbed the old man by the hand and pulled him with me. determined to show him exactly where I'd seen the pit bull and the dead person. Within a minute, I was back to where I found that pit bull. But there was no trace of it. No trace of the body either. Not even a drop of blood on the floor. It was... I swear it was right here, I said, trying to sound less crazy, but probably sounding more so. But I was utterly dumbfounded. I knew what I had seen, what I had been chased by, but now there was no trace of it existing at all. I apologized and quickly ran out of the subway. To this day, I know I saw that pit bull, but whether it was a real dog, or a ghost or a demon or something, that I can't be sure of. But as these stories often say, there is one thing I'm certain of, and that's that the poor janitor probably thinks I'm some druggie. Witch of the Tunnels. From Anonymous. About 20 years ago, I was hired on as a junior maintenance tech for a subway system. Our job was to make sure the integrity of the structures were fine, and that any worries were reported to the foreman. We worked odd hours to avoid trains, often after midnight, when the system was slowest, and we could walk the tracks ourselves. During my first shift, I met a man named Everett. He was a wiry old man with quite steady hands and very cautious. He welcomed me without warmth or coldness, more of a matter-of-fact kind of thing for him. You could tell he had seen dozens come and go. He told me about specific spots that were a concern, places where the ceiling sometimes crumbled, but he never mentioned anything strange, nothing paranormal, no ghost stories. That would come later, through whispered side conversations among the crew. As the new guy, they used these stories to try to creep me out. I was told that I might see flashes of movement out of the corner of my eye. Sometimes I might even hear a whisper. I laughed when I first heard a story like that. What was important to me was learning the routes, not tripping over rails, and not having some stone or concrete fall on my head. A few weeks in, I took notice that Track 7 was a peculiar place. It was a particular area that the crew members would lower their voices when discussing. One of my coworkers even shook her head and sighed anytime she had to go work that line. Another had told me he would rather crawl through a flooded conduit than approach Track 7's maintenance corridor alone. Those two never did give me a straight reason why. That made me a bit nervous. But I did ask around, just to be safe. There was a guy there with the nickname Final. I have no idea why. Even after all my time working there, I had no idea why they called him Final, and nobody would tell me. But that's what we called him, Final. Seems like every job has a guy like that. Weird nickname, no story. Anyway, I decided to ask him, and I finally got an answer. I said, Final, what's with Track 7? Why does everyone get spooked when it comes up? He laughed at me and said that I was bound to find out eventually, and that he'd rather me hear about it than find out the hard way. So apparently, there's a claim that a figure resides down there. A hooded old woman, hunched and quiet. They say she appears under a certain section of Track 7's overhead beams, just standing. If you catch her in your light, you'll regret it. I was smiling when he said that, but Final was now serious. He said they called her the Crone Under 7. Some believe she's a ghost, or something worse. There were apparently stories going back before he even started there. People who did claim to see her mentioned feeling sick afterward and smelling rotting leaves. That night, I didn't really put much thought into it. Just more ghost stories trying to scare the newbie. And if they weren't just to scare me, then it's just more workplace nonsense, you know? Every workplace has their tales. But as more of my shifts passed, I heard more consistent details. A hooded figure, always quiet, always out of direct view, disappearing too fast to be sure they're there. There were people who even said that their equipment would start to act strange. Flashlights with perfectly good batteries suddenly not working. Others said they found piles of rotted leaves, which made no sense in the underground. This brings me to my first experience, near Track 7. It was a quiet Tuesday morning around 2 a.m. I was alone because my partner at the time had hurried off to fix a fuse box about 2 bends away. I had to inspect a joint where the track bed sagged slightly. The corridor felt heavier than usual, air damp and cool. As I lit up the area, I noticed something dark and out of place just in my peripheral. I turned slowly, careful not to surprise myself. Just beyond the beam of my light was a shape. It stood low and was quite still. I couldn't make out many details, but it was the size of a person, cloaked in darkness. I recalled Final's words, "Don't shine the light straight at her." I tilted my flashlight to the side, catching only the edge of the shape. For a second, though, I thought I saw a thin, gnarled hand gripping metal. Then a smell hit me, a faint smell, like decaying foliage. I stepped back then, and when I looked back up, the figure was gone. I stumbled away, nearly dropping my equipment. The following day, shaken by the incident, I asked a coworker, the one who always sighed when she had to work Track 7, if she believed in the crone. She looked side to side, then nodded. "I saw her once, years back. Didn't get too close though, but it was enough. I lost a good pair of pliers that night and found them days later rusted and twisted near that spot. No idea how they got there or how they got like that. I leave that corridor now as quick as I can." Then there was Rivas, a younger worker who had only been around a bit longer than me. He claimed he'd never seen the crone, but he did know a guy who did. A fellow who got too curious approached the figure, calling out for a reaction. The very next shift, the guy quit without notice. Before leaving, he confided in Rivas, allegedly, that he had gotten too close to catch a glimpse of her face under the hood. He saw sunken cheeks and hollow eyes. Apparently, it made him feel weak and nauseous, and that she smelled of earth and rot powerfully. Later on, I was on another late shift. I spotted some odd scratch marks on a steel beam near Track 7's zone. They looked too deliberate, tiny lines etched in patterns. I bent down to examine them and noticed a scattering of small brownish flakes. They looked like dried leaves or petals, though I couldn't guess how they got down here. The idea that some supernatural entity might leave behind debris unsettled me deeply. As you can tell from this story, the longer I worked there, the more and more I believed in the tale of the crone. Anyway, this pile made me wonder. Was this crone carrying stuff from above ground down here? If so, why? Was she nesting in it? Was this person actually just some random hobo? Time went on, sightings became few and far between. But I certainly learned to keep my flashlight beam and eyes away from any human-shaped figures. I ended up working at the place long enough to hear the stories die down, until eventually the old crone legend just completely died off. No one ever talked about her. Nobody ever mentioned seeing her again. I can only assume that maybe her soul or spirit finally passed on, whatever she was, and to this very day, I wonder what the crone really was. Exploring the Tunnel. From Friends of Friends. I swear this happened. Even now, 16 years later, my hands are shaking, trying to type these words out. I was one of those kids you see on late-night cable documentaries. The ones who seek out abandoned buildings and roam through places where no one stepped in decades. Back in the fall of 2008, I was a high school senior in a small Massachusetts town. and I guess I wanted something more thrilling than Friday night football games and cheap horror movies. My two best friends, Adrian and Randy, shared the same itch. We called ourselves urban explorers, though we never spoke about it much to anyone else. We just wanted to find something, anything, that would make us feel like we had uncovered a secret hidden just beneath the everyday world. We'd started small. The old paper mill on the outskirts of town, an abandoned drive-in theater with its rusted speaker posts and overgrown lot, even the administrative building of a closed-down mental hospital. Mostly we found old papers, personal effects, vintage calendars still hanging on mildewed walls. Nothing too scary, just silent reminders of a world that used to be. All of that was tame compared to what we encountered under the ground that one October weekend. I still have the occasional nightmare about those tunnels. If you're reading this or hearing it, I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm just telling you what I saw, what I heard, and what nearly ended my life and the lives of my two closest friends. It was Adrian who first learned about the abandoned subway tunnels. He'd stumbled upon a piece of local history on some obscure message board while researching old transit projects. Apparently, back in the 50s, the town had planned a subway line as part of a statewide expansion. Construction had begun in earnest, sections of tunnel carved through bedrock, concrete platforms partially poured, before the project was abruptly halted. The official reasons were budgetary shortfalls and a series of worker accidents. Unofficially, rumors swirled about something else, something that kept halting progress. The line was never completed, never connected to the main grid. Eventually, everyone just forgot about it. Well, not everyone. We found a handful of cryptic references online. Retired city engineers who claimed the tunnel still existed, sealed away behind maintenance shafts and locked hatches. Adrian was determined to find a way in. Randy and I egged him on. We told our parents we'd be camping that weekend, but instead, we packed up gear suited for an underground trek. On a cool Saturday afternoon, we located what we believed to be an entrance, a shaft behind an old electrical substation. It took a bit of prying with a crowbar, but we managed to open a rusted steel door. Inside, a series of metal rungs led downward into the darkness. I remember looking at Adrian and Randy before we descended. Adrian was grinning nervously. Randy gave me a nod that was half excitement, half concern. None of us said a word. Down we went. The first thing I noticed at the bottom was the smell. A damp and heavy and strangely organic smell, like a long, wet forest floor, but with a sharper and muskier edge. This was unusual. Other underground places smelled of old, ancient air, dust, and mold. This was different. It had an almost animal-like smell to it. We flicked on our lights and found ourselves in a surprisingly intact section of tunnels, with concrete walls, old wiring overhead, and rusted nails that ended abruptly a few yards behind us. The place had been sealed off for decades, yet it didn't seem or look abandoned. We walked for about 20 minutes, talking in hushed voices. The silence was massive down there. Our footsteps echoed ahead into the dark. Then we noticed something weird. There were marks on the walls, deep gouges in concrete. They looked like claw marks. I remember Randy running his gloved fingertips over one of them. He muttered, "What the heck could this be?" None of us had an answer. A few steps later, Randy found droppings on the ground. They were large and irregular, unlike any animal scat we've come across before. We had encountered plenty of raccoons, possums, even feral cats in old buildings, but this didn't match anything. It was too large, too strange. Randy knelt beside it, shining his light over the lumps and wrinkling his nose in disgust. Then we heard a faint sound, a scrape, like something with claws skittering out of sight. We froze, listening. Silence. We moved on, now more cautiously. A few 100 feet deeper, we began finding carcasses. Not rats or small birds, these were larger animals. Half-eaten remains of what looked like dogs and, astonishingly, a deer. We stumbled upon that deer's headless body, ribs exposed, the flesh ragged. Adrian's voice cracked as he whispered, "This can't be possible. How would a deer even get down here?" I had no explanation, and my heart sank. Whatever made its lair in these tunnels was strong enough to haul significant prey underground. And it wasn't just killing, it was feeding. Adrian was the first to sense we were being watched. He kept spinning around, aiming his flashlight into the dark behind us. He said he saw movement, a shifting shape, but when we looked together, we saw nothing. But then we started to hear it too. The quiet scrape of something on concrete, distant breathing that didn't belong to any of us. Our flashlights picked out nothing but empty corridor and dripping walls, yet I felt eyes on us, tracking our progress. We pressed on, hoping to find another exit. The tunnel system branched in unexpected ways, old passages that never made it onto public maps. Some sections were utterly silent and devoid of life, while others had more nests, mounds of debris twisted into something like bedding. At one point, we found a large alcove chiseled out of the wall. Inside were bones arranged in a bizarre pattern, as though something not only lived here, but had a sense of order. That was when I noticed how quiet Randy had gotten. His jaw was set and he kept his flashlight trained low, scanning for tracks. Then came the first real sighting. We were turning a corner when Adrian's flashlight caught a glimpse of a limb, something pale and muscular, and jointed in a way that made my stomach twist. It vanished an instant later, pulling back behind concrete pillars. It was tall, that much was clear, with a reach far beyond human proportions, and those eyes, reflective, high up, gleaming just for a moment before blinking out of view. We knew then it was no mere animal. The thing was very agile, very cunning. It was driving us deeper, playing some game of cat and mouse. We tried to retrace our steps, but the tunnel suddenly felt like a maze. We turned left where we thought we had turned right before, only to encounter dead ends or collapsed sections. Several times we heard a rasping sound, a guttural clicking that echoed behind us, bouncing off the walls and confusing our sense of direction. It blocked certain passages, forcing us into corridors that seemed narrower and darker than before. The feeling was unmistakable. It was hurting us. When we finally decided to make a break for it, we scrambled down a tunnel we thought led back to our entrance shaft. Our breathing was loud now. We were panicked. The creature's presence was stronger and closer. The beams of our lights jittered across the walls as our hands shook. We reached a wide, partially finished station area, a large chamber with support columns and incomplete platforms. And that is when it attacked. We never got a full, clear look. Just a massive shape launching at us from the shadows, claws scraping against concrete as it lunged towards Adrian. He screamed and stumbled. Randy and I grabbed his arms, hauling him backward just in time. My flashlight beam danced over something vaguely humanoid, yet terribly wrong. 2 long limbs, hunched shoulders, and eyes that glowed in the beam's reflection. Its skin was a mottled gray, and I swear I saw patches of hair or spines along its limbs. We ran. I can't recall the exact route we took. We followed instinct and the faint draft of fresh air. The creature gave chase, footsteps echoing, always a few paces behind, sometimes parallel in adjacent corridors. It moved with frightening speed and cunning, cutting us off, trying to corner us. At one junction, we had to throw ourselves down a narrow chute, scraping our knees and elbows on concrete just to avoid it. By some miracle, we found ourselves back at the ladder. We could see the faint outline of the hatch where we'd entered. Adrian's ankle was twisted and Randy's backpack was shredded. I climbed first, forcing the hatch open, letting in the cold night air. Randy pushed Adrian up after me, then scrambled up himself. As I stood on the surface, breathing so hard my lungs ached, I caught one last glimpse into the darkness below. For a moment, I saw a silhouette at the bottom. Tall, gaunt, eyes reflecting the moon. Then we slammed the hatch shut. Randy even wedged a piece of metal debris against it. We didn't say a word until we were halfway home. In the following weeks, I scoured local papers. There were more reports of missing pets, cats and dogs, vanishing without a trace. Workers were seen near drainage systems and old tunnels, sealing entrances, doing routine maintenance. But no official explanation ever came. We kept our story to ourselves. Who would believe we were hunted by some unknown creature in an abandoned subway line? Adrian had nightmares for months. Randy refused to even speak of it. As for me, I did my best to find some sort of scientific explanation. Maybe it was an undocumented species, a feral person, a cave-adapted predator. Nothing fits quite right. Whatever it was smart and had a taste for prey large enough to include us. I still live in Massachusetts, in a different town now. Sometimes late at night, when I pass over a sidewalk grate or walk near an old storm drain, I smell that same damp organic musk, and I can't help but wonder, as I hurry on by, if that thing is still down there, watching. The tunnels beneath our cities stretch on and on, dark and long forgotten. God knows what lurks in those places where the sun never shines. You'll never find me in a place like that again. That brings us to the end of this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I hope you enjoyed these tales of underground terror. If you have a story of your own and want to be featured in a future episode, send it to us at darkstories.org. I'll see you again soon. But for now, please subscribe and like this video if you're on YouTube. If you're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or a different podcast platform, please follow Unexplained Encounters and leave us an honest rating or review to help us reach new fans. Some quick mentions. You can get our merch at eeriecast.store. You can buy my cryptid card battling game at cryptidcardgame.com. You can follow me on X at Prevails. And if you want to unlock exclusive access to horror audiobooks and get all our podcasts with no ads, consider becoming a member at eeriecast.com/plus. Until next time, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.